वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today, it's our pleasure and privilege to have with us Professor Mark Sidel. Mark Sidel is Doyle-Bascom Professor of Law and Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He earlier worked in senior program positions at the Ford Foundation in Delhi, Beijing, Bangkok, and Hanoi, and has worked on civil society and philanthropy issues in China since the late 1980s. We have today invited Professor Sidel to discuss on a very interesting subject on China, i.e. the state of civil society in China after the 2022 Party Congress, that is after the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, when President Xi Jinping was re-elected as the General Secretary of the CCP for the third term. And it is very apt time that now when the two sessions are going on in China, we have invited him to discuss on how this is going to really reshape in terms of the civil society. So welcome to our show, Professor Sidel. So let me just begin by asking you to give a brief understanding of the civil society in China, especially after the 20th Party Congress that you understand and how things have developed over the years. Yeah.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I appreciate being invited. Let me say, as you suggest, a few words about the situation for civil society in China after the October 2022 Party Congress. And as you point out, we are seeing the two sessions, especially the National People's Congress session going on now. And so we're going to continue to see some structural changes and personnel changes after this most recent set of meetings as well. But let me just raise a couple points, just for a couple minutes, about where I think civil society is heading in China after last year's Party Congress. The broad general direction for civil society in China after the Party Congress was laid out approximately a decade ago when Xi Jinping came into full power in China. And that is increasing political and particularly party control over the civil society sector in China. But when I say that, let me stop to indicate some of the parts or the spectrum that covers civil society in China. Because civil society in China is not a blank slate. There are actually hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of organizations in China that fit within some general definition of nonprofit or charitable or non-governmental in China. They range from small nonprofit organizations at the local level, sometimes registered, sometimes not. They include foundations, an increasing number of various kinds of foundations registered throughout China. They include large and small associations at the national level, at the provincial level, at the sub-provincial level, and a variety of other kinds of nonprofit organizations. So China is not North Korea. China does not have no nonprofit or no civil society sector. It does have a nonprofit sector, and it's a broad and very vibrant nonprofit sector in one particular aspect, and that is providing social services to Chinese citizens. A role for the nonprofit sector in China, the voluntary sector in China, that has been increasingly emphasized during the Xi Jinping period in China. So what we're seeing is increasing control over nonprofits. We are seeing an increasing direction for nonprofits to be pushed toward service provision and pushed away from political advocacy or other advocacy positions. And that is going to accelerate after the most recent Party Congress. So with that background in mind, and I'm pleased to answer more questions about that, let me indicate 4 or 5 directions for the civil society sector in China after the Party Congress. For nearly 10 years now, first, the Xi Jinping administration in China, and particularly the Communist Party and the state, have hoped that the social sector, including the nonprofit voluntary sector, would play an increasing role in the common prosperity agenda of the Chinese party and government, which is trying to, over time, reduce gaps in income and gaps in wealth within Chinese society. The hope has been that along with the party and state and along with the business community, the social sector, including the voluntary sector, would play a role in reducing those gaps. So far, that's been quite hit or miss. And so one of the things we're going to be on the lookout for after the Party Congress is whether there's a renewed emphasis on the role of the voluntary sector in reducing gaps in Chinese society and increasing what has been called the common prosperity agenda. A second point for the civil society in China has to do with the increasing nature of political, particularly party control over the voluntary sector. You might think that after 10 years of this overall push for more political, more party control over the voluntary sector, that agenda had been completed, but it has not. And we are still seeing areas in which increasing party or political control over the voluntary sector is being expanded. Let me mention a couple of those that some of my colleagues have been writing about, or that I've been writing about with some colleagues. We are seeing the continued extension, the rapid extension of political and administrative controls over volunteering in China. That was, until recently, a relatively unregulated sector in China. It's now become increasingly regulated. We are seeing the party take over what we call nonprofit or voluntary sector self-regulation, in which groups of nonprofits or voluntary sector organizations, civil society organizations, get together to develop codes of conduct or other self-regulatory mechanisms. Increasingly in Shanghai and elsewhere, the Communist Party is taking over that process, somewhat worried that nonprofit self-regulation will imply nonprofit autonomy or more nonprofit voluntary sector power. And we are seeing, and this will be familiar to some of your listeners who focus on China, we're seeing the extension of the social credit system to the voluntary sector in China. And there's been some good research on that recently. So, third, is there any hope for Chinese nonprofit organizations, voluntary sector organizations, after the Party Congress that want to do something other than providing services? Is there any hope for Chinese voluntary sector or civil society sector organizations that want to do policy advocacy or that actually want to engage in forms of political advocacy in China? And the short answer to that is that space has been over time narrowing, being restricted in China since before 2012, but particularly since 2012. And that space continues to be narrowing. And so we're not going to see an expansion of public advocacy or policy advocacy nonprofits in China. What we are likely to see is the small space that's available for certain kinds of disability organizations or environmental organizations. Some of those may have a small space, not for political advocacy, but for policy advocacy. And for others, that space continues to narrow. What about overseas or foreign foundations, non-governmental organizations? Many countries, including India, have systems in place which provide some restrictions or constraints on the work that overseas or foreign foundations, NGOs, and other groups can do within the country. In India, for example, you have the FCRA system and other constraints on the work that foreign foundations and NGOs can do. China is similar. China has a very wide-ranging, since 2016, framework called the Overseas NGO Law, which constrains what overseas organizations can do in China and what Chinese organizations can do working with those overseas groups. Is there any possibility after the Party Congress that we're going to see some liberalization in this increasingly strict regime? And the answer is, in short form, no. This regime has been in place since 2017 when the law came into effect. All foreign, overseas, nonprofit organizations in China have been brought under the control of a unified framework, which is headed by the Ministry of Public Security in China. And while there has been hope in China that this relatively strict framework might be relaxed a bit, I think that hope is misplaced, and we are unlikely to see changes toward liberalization in that framework. Finally, what about the regulation of the domestic voluntary sector area in China? Since 2016, that has been governed by an overall charity law, something like the Societies Registration Acts in India, if those were enacted at the national level rather than at the state level. China is a unitary state, and so the charity law was passed at the national level, the federal level. It's now undergoing revision, and this is something I'm doing some research on right now. And so the question has been, are we going to see any form of relaxation or liberalization in these kinds of rules that allow a wider array of non-governmental organizations to register and legalize in China? And the short answer, but I think that your listeners are sensing a theme here, the short answer is that we're not going to see a relaxation in that framework. We're going to see some interesting changes to that framework to keep up with the rapid development of the social sector in China in areas like charitable trusts and fundraising, where things have developed very quickly, but we're not going to see a fundamental relaxation. So those are some points with respect to the situation for voluntary sector organizations in China after the Party Congress, and I am delighted to try to answer any questions you have.
Yeah, so I mean, you absolutely said, very right that there is a constraint of the kind of civil society that was there, and for the last decade, that change is quite remarkably visible. Having said that, I mean, one of the things which everyone is looking at is that, when there are these changes happening in the civil society, like there was this campaign of 709 campaign in 2015 and others of the sort, what is different after 2022 and how that affects the larger society in China? I mean, that's more of our concern just about the non-governmental organizations. Yeah.
The campaigns against the more political aspects of civil society, human rights defenders, public interest lawyers, and others, like the 709 campaign in 2015 that you're referencing, those have resulted over the past 10 plus years in the almost elimination of the more political aspects of Chinese civil society. We're not going to see any relaxation in that. But frankly, at this point, most of the public interest or political advocacy groups that at one point or another were active or registered under a nonprofit or charitable status or umbrella, most of those have now been closed or have been forced to move from advocacy into service provision in order to stay alive, in order to stay functioning. So I don't think we're going to see a change in policy. It's been a very restrictive policy toward those kinds of advocacy organizations. Some of the leaders are in prison. Many of the organizations have been canceled, not allowed to exist. So we're not going to see, I think, a tremendous movement against those groups now after the Party Congress, but that's because most of those groups have been neutered or made impossible to carry out their advocacy tasks as a result of multiple campaigns, multiple detentions, multiple prosecutions since 2012. So what the result is, and you're asking about the broader effects on Chinese society, what the result is that we have a vibrant social sector, we have a vibrant non-governmental voluntary sector in China, which is growing and which is attracting more donations from the public in China. But it is also a sector that is focused almost entirely on the provision of social services, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. In other countries, the United States, England, India, lots of countries around the world, civil society plays what we might call a somewhat broader role. They don't only focus on social services, they also focus on policy advocacy and a range of other topics. That's not what China wants. The sector, the nonprofit sector, the voluntary sector that China seeks to mold is one that focuses almost entirely on the provision of social services approved by the government and increasingly funded by the government. And that means that the advocacy side of the sector has, to a significant degree, disappeared in China, and that's the trend going forward as well.
You know, when you're talking about the entire civil society and when we are having this conversation on a day when we are celebrating International Women's Day, one of the things which comes to my mind was that in '97, when I was in China, they were hosting this International Women's Conference, you know, first of its kind. And over the periods, we have seen a lot of movements coming in China, especially the Me Too movement, if you see, and there is a backlash. But what I have seen in the recent past, when Xi Jinping has come to power, is also a very strict rules for, you know, how the actions are taken against people who are, you know, involved in any kinds of crimes against women, right? Whether it is academically, you know, in the academic institutions or whether it is in public. So how do you see these? But at the same time, there is a crackdown on the Me Too as well, you know. So there is this, you know, what I say, a paradox of, you know, situation where there is a policy to crack down on those who are violators, but at the same time, there is a crackdown on women's mobilization to come out and, you know, have the advocacy movement. So how do you see this paradox, especially in the current situation on women in China?
That's a great question. And I have to say that I don't see it as a paradox. I see it as in China, the Communist Party and the Chinese state attempting to take control over enforcement in this area, not leaving it to mobilization by the voluntary sector in any significant way. So we are seeing a major crackdown on corruption. We are seeing leaders and some civil servants being targeted. We are seeing some increasing visibility to prosecuting crimes against women. That is all coming from the party and state. China is not leaving to the social sector, to the voluntary sector, the role of mobilizing prosecutions or enforcement against people who violate the rights of women or people who engage in corruption. The state is taking full charge, led by the party in that area. And so in that sense, I don't see it as a paradox. The party and state are rising and continuing to rise in the enforcement area. The voluntary sector is over time, over a decade or more, in decline in terms of mobilizing enforcement against violators. And that is exactly what the party and state in China are seeking to accomplish, which is a more unified, a more active party and state apparatus to deal with enforcement and violations, and not relying on the voluntary sector to try to push the state forward. Really, what the Chinese party and state want from the voluntary sector, as I said before, is the provision of social services, not mobilizing the population against violations of rights against women, not mobilizing the population against violations of other rights. That's not what it wants from the voluntary sector.
Yeah, but you just mentioned about this corruption thing, and very aptly, if I see, you know, the pre-pandemic time, you know, the kind of crackdown that was, you know, taken over by the regime, that's the President Xi Jinping's and the government. You know, most of the people in China were quite happy with it. So the popularity of Xi Jinping was really going up in one sense, right? But at the same time, if I see the post-COVID time, just, you know, last few months, suddenly there was this, you know, whole mass mobilization of, you know, of the rules that were imposed of COVID, and people were coming out on streets. And we have seen many videos coming out where Shanghai, Beijing, and everywhere, you know, there's a sudden mobilization of the people who are against the rules that are being imposed. So how do you see this mass mobilization when you're saying that the party doesn't want that and the state is not really wanting that to happen, but that is happening on the ground? How do you see that as an evolution of changes?
You know, it's interesting because The party state framework in China is an authoritarian framework, but it is also in some ways a responsive framework as well. China has had significant problems with corruption over the past decades. And the Xi Jinping administration, when it came into power in 2012, was responsive to and recognized the corruption issues and cracked down on corruption. That's not only authoritarian, and it's carried out in a legalistic way, but it's also responsive. It was also responsive to what it was hearing from the Chinese citizenry about the dangers of corruption and the disgust over corruption. Fast forward to the pandemic times, when China went under, as you know, and many of your listeners know, a series of harsh and rolling lockdowns in many cities over long periods of time since early 2020. We both have friends in China, and many of your listeners do too, who emerged from the pandemic, I would say, traumatized by their experience during the pandemic, being locked up in their houses or in their compounds, in some cases having difficulty getting food, kids not being able to go to school, things like that. And that sparked a response from the Chinese population. That response came very quickly after the Party Congress in October. We saw that. That's the videos. That's the blank paper protests. That's the marches that you're talking about. And we also saw a certain response. China was getting ready to relax its COVID restrictions anyway. But to some degree, the party state took advantage of the protests to relax the restrictions almost immediately, which it had already been planning to do. The result was, unfortunately, most of urban China becoming infected with COVID extremely quickly. There were a couple of weeks there in which virtually every single person I know in China and their families either had COVID or had just had COVID. It spread extraordinarily quickly. But the protests were against the overly harsh situations of crackdown. And interestingly, the response from the party state, which was already planned, was accelerated to reduce many of the COVID restrictions. In this, there has been almost no role for the voluntary sector itself. There has been a role for individual protesters who are now being punished in China. But there's not been a role for non-governmental organizations. There's not been a role for civil society organizations. In India, if it were a somewhat analogous situation, there would be CSOs, there would be voluntary sector organizations that might be raising questions about policy, might even be leading protests, things like that. That's not the Chinese situation these days. So we see an authoritarian state, and we see responses from citizens, and we see responses from the authoritarian state to protests by citizens. And that's, I think, some of the dynamic that we are seeing. But we're now also in a different situation for Xi Jinping and for China than 2017 and 2018. China has gone through a traumatic pandemic, 3-year roughly period, almost 3 years. And I think that the party state leadership in China is watching very carefully to see how the economy is going to resume and how citizens are feeling coming out of the pandemic. It's impossible to predict, but one thing we can predict is that we're not going to see an enlivened voluntary sector, civil society sector, coming out of the pandemic. That policy is set, and that policy is based on political restriction, but at the same time, strongly encouraging and strongly funding a range of civil society organizations to provide social services.
But you just mentioned about, how the, foreign NGOs are going to work in China, and what is going to be the exchange between the civil society organizations of China and the foreign organizations which are going to work. Especially, I've seen that change in terms of the Taiwanese NGOs. who are facing a serious challenge in China, but other organizations as well. I mean, in terms of the human rights and other civil society organizations. But looking at how China is transforming under Xi Jinping, or what are the greater changes that are going to happen now after Xi Jinping has acquired the third term. Now, what are the lessons that one can draw from the current situation of this new China that we are facing? And how do you see other states need to be prepared to deal with this new China, especially the challenges it will pose for people-to-people exchanges with other countries?
Yeah, that's a very important question. It's a big question. It's something we're thinking about very intensively in the US now. I know that people are thinking about it in India and other large, powerful countries that have to work with China on a bilateral or a multilateral basis. As we emerge from the pandemic, and as we emerge from 10 years of this increasingly centralized administration in China, in which the party is becoming more and more important over time, that raises the specific kinds of complicated questions you're raising about exchanges and about people-to-people exchanges. Look, we have gone through 3 years of virtually no exchanges in person that have been available with China. China does not regret that. At least the party state does not regret that. Some intellectuals regret that, the unavailability of exchanges. Some civil society activists might regret that. But the party state does not regret the lack of exchanges, in-person exchanges, over the past 3 years. So the first thing that I think is important is that even though the situation in China remains difficult and bilateral relations, for example, between my country, the US, and China, are very, very difficult right now, is as we emerge from the pandemic to re-emphasize engaging where we can with China. That means going back, in my view, to Chinese universities where we are invited. It means engaging in policy dialogue on areas where China is willing to engage in track 2 or other kinds of policy dialogue. That may be environmental and energy issues. It may be climate change issues. It may be other issues as well. It may be more technical issues than we might want to emphasize, but if that's the only way of engaging with sectors of Chinese society right now, coming out of the pandemic, and in a situation in which there's very significant political controls in China, then we will have dialogue on the technical issues. So for me, the first step is re-engaging with China where our Chinese partners, our Chinese interlocutors are able to re-engage. That will not be in all areas by any means. China will allow academics, voluntary sector people, and others to re-engage in dialogue in certain ways at certain times through certain channels on certain issues. And I think we have to accept that in the short term, meaning the next couple of years, and re-engage where we can. And then I think we have to see where we are. It may be that that process of cautious re-engagement between China and the world will be somewhat successful and that more will be possible in the next couple of years. It may be that the situation remains in a kind of condition of stasis where not much is possible. But for me, speaking from the United States, the importance is re-engaging with China. This is not a time to deny engagement with China. It's a time to try to engage where we can. That is not going to be easy, but it's particularly important as China emerges from the pandemic, but in a situation where authoritarian control in China is still extremely strong and getting stronger under the Xi Jinping third term.
Yeah, I mean, when Xi Jinping has just clearly stated, US is one which has posed real challenges for China to engage, and the challenges for China to be, the domestic challenges have increased, and he has clearly pointed out that. I'm sure that US and China engagement is going to be really tough, but I think with other countries, as you just mentioned, other major powers are also going to deal a great deal of difficulty. India is dealing a great deal of difficulty engaging with China at political level and at the security level, and those are the issues which are going to be very pertinent for all the bilateral and multilateral issue, engagements. But having said that, it was a great pleasure talking to you, listening to you, Professor Maxwell, and hope we continue our interactions. There will be much more discussions, much more deeper interactions that we can have. And thank you for, giving us time for this short kind of an introduction to understand what civil society is engaging in and how it is evolving in China, especially under President Xi Jinping after 2022. So to our viewers, please hit the like icon and subscribe to our channel for more interesting discussions of this sort. And thank you very much for watching this. Namaskar.
Thank you.